A study of over 6 million couples across Taiwan, Denmark, and Sweden just found something that should stop you mid-scroll. People are significantly more likely to end up with a partner who shares their exact psychiatric diagnosis. Not a similar personality, not a compatible energy, the same diagnosis. And once you understand the mechanism researchers think is driving it, you'll never look at your own dating history the same way again. Let's start with what the study actually found, because the finding itself is more precise than the headline makes it sound. Researchers pulled national health records across 3 countries and looked at millions of real couples, tracking documented psychiatric diagnoses on both sides of each relationship. What they found wasn't a mild tendency. It was a strong, consistent pattern. Across depression, anxiety disorders, ADHD, and several other conditions, people partnered with someone carrying the same diagnosis far more often than random chance would predict. This isn't a small effect buried in noise. It shows up across 3 separate countries with 3 separate healthcare systems, which is exactly the kind of replication that makes a finding hard to dismiss as a fluke. And it's worth being precise about what this doesn't mean, too, because it would be easy to walk away with the wrong takeaway. It doesn't mean people are consciously screening potential partners for a matching diagnosis. Nobody is filling out a form. It means something quieter and, in some ways, more unsettling. Whatever is pulling people together is happening well below the level of conscious choice, consistently enough across millions of people to show up clearly in the data. You can watch a version of this pattern in your own life, probably, without ever having had a name for it. The partner who cancels plans the same way you do, last minute, with the same specific flavor of guilt-laced explanation. The partner whose silence during conflict feels eerily like your own instinct to disappear. The partner who spirals over a delayed text exactly the way you do, checking their phone with the same nervous rhythm you recognize in your own hands. None of this shows up on a first date as a diagnosis. It shows up as chemistry, as an easy, immediate sense that this person simply gets it, gets you, in a way almost no one else ever has. It's worth sitting with how ordinary this can look from the outside, because none of it announces itself as a pattern in the moment. Friends might describe the two of you as a lot alike, meant warmly, meant as a compliment. You might even say it about yourselves, half joking, that you found the one other person who worries the way you worry, who disappears the way you disappear. It gets folded into the origin story of the relationship, the cute detail you tell people at dinner. Nobody in that conversation is thinking about diagnostic categories or nervous system wiring. But the study suggests that cute detail might be doing more structural work than anyone at that dinner table realizes. Here's the story, and here's the structure underneath it. The story says, I just happen to fall for someone who gets it, someone who understands what I go through because they go through something similar. The structure says something colder and more precise. You were not drawn to understanding. You were drawn to recognition. Those are not the same thing, and the difference between them is exactly what this video is going to unpack. Why would this happen at this scale, across cultures, across healthcare systems that don't talk to each other? Researchers offer a few explanations, and the one that matters most for this conversation is assortative mating through shared environment and shared relational patterning. Not random chance, and not simple proximity. People with similar unresolved wounds tend to move through the world in similar ways, show up in similar spaces, respond to stress in similarly recognizable rhythms, and recognize something in each other long before either person could name what it is. Attachment theory offers one of the clearest lenses for understanding why. A nervous system organized around anxiety recognizes anxious rhythm instantly. A nervous system organized around avoidance recognizes avoidant rhythm instantly. Two systems shaped by similar unprocessed material tend to find each other, not because they're compatible in the way people usually mean that word, but because they are, in a very real physiological sense, speaking the same dialect of dysregulation. There's an evolutionary layer worth naming here too, because it makes this pattern feel less like a personal flaw and more like an old survival mechanism running in a context it was never built for. For most of human history, quickly assessing whether another person was safe, predictable, and part of your world was a genuine survival advantage. A nervous system that could rapidly categorize someone as familiar, as known, as belonging to a recognizable category could make faster decisions about closeness, faster than slow, careful, conscious evaluation would ever allow. That speed used to matter. It still fires just as fast today, except now it's not sorting people by tribe or threat, it's sorting them by whether their nervous system's rhythm matches the one you grew up inside of, whether or not that rhythm was ever actually good for you. This is the part worth sitting with, because it reframes something you've probably experienced without ever having language for it. You meet someone, and something clicks almost instantly, faster than logic can account for. It doesn't feel like getting to know a stranger. It feels like remembering someone. That feeling gets interpreted almost every time as chemistry, as fate, as finally being understood. What the data suggests is quieter and less romantic. Your nervous system may simply be recognizing a familiar pattern of dysregulation, the same shape of anxiety or avoidance or emotional unpredictability it already knows intimately, whether or not that pattern is actually healthy for either of you. Let's talk about the nervous system mechanics, because this isn't just a statistic. It's a felt experience you've probably lived through more than once. Familiarity and safety get processed by the body as nearly the same signal, even when they shouldn't be. A nervous system that grew up around a specific flavor of unpredictability, a specific rhythm of withdrawal and return, a specific intensity of emotional expression, learns to read that exact flavor as normal, as expected, as home. When you meet someone whose internal weather runs on a similar pattern, even if that pattern is anxious, even if it's avoidant, even if it's genuinely destabilizing, your body doesn't necessarily register danger. It often registers recognition. And recognition gets mistaken for safety far more often than it should. It's also worth naming how modern dating accelerates this exact mechanism, because the recognition this study describes doesn't only happen slowly across months of getting to know someone. It can happen in seconds, scrolling through a dating app, landing on a photo and a 2-line bio, and feeling an inexplicable pull toward a total stranger. That pull gets read as instinct, as taste, as knowing what you like. But a nervous system that's spent years calibrated to a specific emotional frequency doesn't need months of conversation to recognize that frequency. Sometimes it only needs a tone in a message, a certain kind of joke, a certain kind of intensity in how quickly someone texts back or doesn't. The speed of that recognition can feel like proof it's meant to be, when it may just be proof that the pattern is well worn enough to be recognized instantly, from very little information at all. This is where it gets specifically relevant for anxious attachment, because your nervous system is especially tuned to scan for and respond to emotional intensity. Someone whose internal experience runs on a similar frequency to yours, similar spirals, similar highs and lows, similar underlying ache, doesn't read as a red flag. It reads as understanding. You think, finally, someone who actually gets what this feels like from the inside. And sometimes that's true. Sometimes shared struggle really does build real empathy. But the data suggests something else is often happening underneath that story. Two dysregulated systems finding each other and calling the resulting intensity love, when what's actually being activated is mutual recognition of an unprocessed wound. Not necessarily compatibility, and not necessarily safety. There's a cost to this worth naming plainly, because it rarely gets said out loud in the middle of falling for someone. When two people meet through recognition rather than genuine compatibility, the early stage of the relationship can feel almost supernaturally easy. No explaining required. No translating your inner world into language someone unfamiliar with it could understand. That ease feels like proof you found something rare. But ease at the beginning is not the same signal as health over time. And a relationship that started because it required zero adjustment from either person is also a relationship that, structurally, has nothing yet pushing either of you to become more regulated than you already were the day you met. Now let's talk about what this actually creates once two people with matching unresolved patterns build a relationship together. Because the effect isn't neutral. When both people carry a similar wound, that wound doesn't automatically get smaller. It often gets reinforced because neither person is positioned to offer the other something genuinely different. Two anxious nervous systems can spiral each other higher, each one's panic confirming the other's fear. Two avoidant nervous systems can create a relationship built entirely on parallel independence, where neither person ever has to practice real vulnerability, because neither one is pushing for it. The relationship can feel deeply understood and deeply stuck at the exact same time, because understanding a wound and healing a wound require completely different things, and a relationship built on shared diagnosis often has plenty of the first and very little of the second. This is where the misread happens, and it's worth naming precisely. You start treating recognition as proof of health. Because someone understands your specific flavor of struggle instantly, without you having to explain it, you assume this means the relationship is good for you. Sometimes it is, but instant, effortless recognition is not the same as a relationship that's actually equipped to help you grow past the pattern you're both recognizing in each other. A relationship can feel like the deepest understanding you've ever experienced and still be, structurally, two unhealed patterns holding each other in place instead of helping each other move. There's a second misread stacked on top of the first one. You start believing that shared struggle automatically produces mutual healing, that two people who understand the same pain will naturally help each other work through it. Sometimes that happens, but shared struggle can just as easily produce shared avoidance of the actual work. Two people quietly agreeing, without ever saying it out loud, not to push each other toward the harder, more uncomfortable growth that neither of you has done yet. It's easier to stay in a familiar pattern with someone who validates it than to be with someone whose different nervous system gently, persistently asks you to become someone new. There's a third misread worth naming, quieter than the first two, but just as costly over time. You start assuming that because someone shares your pattern, they must also understand exactly what you need in the moments the pattern shows up. That's often the opposite of what actually happens. Two anxious partners in the middle of a spiral don't necessarily know how to soothe each other because neither one has practiced staying regulated long enough to be a steady presence for someone else's panic. Two avoidant partners in the middle of a shutdown don't necessarily know how to draw each other back out because neither one has practiced staying in the room when everything in them wants to leave it. Shared struggle can look, from a distance, like it should produce shared fluency in handling that struggle. In practice, it often produces two people equally unequipped for the exact moment they both need help the most. So, what's actually missing here, structurally, when two people with matching unresolved wounds build a life together without addressing this dynamic directly? It's a genuinely different nervous system in the mix, one that doesn't automatically recognize your specific pattern as normal, one that can offer you a felt experience of a different way of being in relationship, not just an echo of the one you already know. That doesn't mean you need to date someone who doesn't understand your struggles. It means the relationship needs at least one steady source, sometimes from a partner, sometimes from your own individual work, that isn't simply mirroring the same dysregulation back to you and calling it love. Here's a way to test whether what you're in is real compatibility or familiar recognition. Ask yourself honestly, does this relationship, over time, help either of you become more regulated, more secure, more able to tolerate discomfort without spiraling or disappearing? Or does it mostly feel like two people confirming, again and again, that this specific kind of chaos, this specific kind of distance, this specific kind of intensity is simply what relationships are like? Real growth in a relationship usually feels like friction at some point, a partner gently pushing back on a pattern instead of matching it. If nothing about the relationship has ever asked you to grow past your original wound, that absence of friction might not be peace. It might be two familiar patterns quietly agreeing to stay exactly the same. This shows up outside romantic relationships too. Worth a quick mention before we go further, because the same recognition mechanism drives who you pick as close friends, sometimes even who you're drawn to on a work team. The friend who spirals the exact same way you do about the same kinds of things. The colleague whose avoidance under pressure mirrors your own so closely that you never have to explain why you both went quiet in that meeting. None of that is a coincidence either, and the same caution applies. Familiarity in a friendship can be just as easily mistaken for depth as familiarity in a romantic relationship can. It also helps to notice how this shows up in specific, recurring moments, because the pattern doesn't announce itself with a diagnosis label. It shows up in daily texture. It's both of you spiraling on the same night, feeding each other's anxiety instead of grounding one another. It's both of you going quiet during conflict, an entire relationship built on avoidance where neither of you has ever actually practiced staying in a hard conversation. It's the specific relief of never having to explain yourself, paired with the specific stagnation of never being gently challenged either. Each of these moments feels like intimacy. Stacked together, they can also be the shape of two wounds sitting comfortably next to each other, undisturbed. This pattern doesn't stay the same size over the life of a relationship either. It tends to compound with time and with stakes. Two people who found each other through recognition might manage the early years fine, when the relationship is mostly about the two of them and there's room to absorb each other's rhythms. Add the pressure of a shared home, a shared bank account, children, aging parents, and the same wound that once felt like understanding can start to feel like two people drowning in the same water, each one too depleted to be the other's rescue. This is often when couples show up in therapy describing a relationship that used to feel effortless and now feels unbearably heavy, without being able to name what changed. Frequently, nothing changed. The stakes simply grew large enough to expose a structural gap that was always there, quietly, underneath the ease. I want to be careful here, because this isn't a case against relationships with people who share your struggles. Plenty of people with matching patterns build genuinely healthy, growing relationships, especially once both people are doing real individual work alongside the relationship itself. The point isn't that shared diagnosis dooms a relationship. The point is that shared diagnosis, on its own, is not evidence of health, and the instant sense of being deeply understood deserves a second look rather than automatic trust. Recognition is a starting point. It was never meant to be the whole relationship. It's also worth saying plainly that none of this makes the connection fake. The empathy two people build from genuinely understanding the same internal weather is real empathy, not an illusion. And it can become one of the most valuable things a relationship has, especially once both people are aware enough to use that understanding on purpose instead of just falling into it. The goal was never to talk anyone out of loving someone who reminds them of themselves. The goal is to stop mistaking the recognition itself for the entire job of the relationship, so that understanding becomes a starting resource you build from, instead of an ending point you quietly stop growing past. There's a broader pattern worth naming here too, because it explains why this finding lands as more validating than alarming for a lot of people. For years, the popular idea of compatibility has centered on shared interests, shared values, shared humor, shared vision for the future. This study points at something underneath all of that. Shared nervous system wiring, formed long before either person could choose it, quietly steering who feels like a match and who doesn't. You're not choosing partners as randomly or as freely as it feels like you are in the moment. Some significant part of the pull is your own unprocessed history, recognizing itself in someone else's, and mistaking that recognition for choice. Here's the practical piece, because insight without a next step just becomes one more interesting fact to sit with, something you nod along to and then carry back into the exact same dynamic tomorrow. If you notice this pattern in your own relationship history, the move isn't to panic or to start avoiding anyone who reminds you of yourself. The move is to get specific about what the recognition is actually doing in the relationship you're in right now. Does being understood in this relationship come paired with being gently challenged sometimes? Or does it come paired with never having to face the pattern at all? Someone can love you and still, unintentionally, help keep you exactly where you started, simply by finding your wound so familiar that neither of you ever names it as a wound in the first place. The second move is doing the work that doesn't depend on your partner's diagnosis matching or not matching yours. Attachment patterns shift through your own nervous system doing something different, not through finding someone whose nervous system happens to be different from yours. You can be with someone who shares your exact struggle and still build real security together. But it usually requires both people consciously choosing to interrupt the pattern instead of unconsciously reinforcing it, which is a very different thing from simply falling into a relationship because it felt instantly, effortlessly familiar. The third move is learning to sit with a specific kind of discomfort, a relationship or a person who doesn't immediately feel like coming home. Because your nervous system has learned to read familiar dysregulation as safety, actual safety, the steady, sometimes quieter, sometimes less intense feeling of being with someone genuinely secure can initially feel underwhelming, even boring, simply because it doesn't match the pattern your body has always called love. That flatness isn't proof something is missing. It's often proof that something different, something your nervous system has never practiced trusting, is finally in the room. There's a fourth move worth naming, and it's the one people skip most often because it doesn't feel productive in the moment. naming the pattern out loud, together, without turning it into blame. Most couples who share a wound never actually say the words to each other. They live inside the pattern without labeling it, which means every instance of it gets treated as a fresh, isolated incident instead of a recognizable rhythm with a name. Something as simple as saying out loud, "I think we're doing the thing again," can interrupt a spiral that neither person could interrupt alone, because it turns an unconscious pattern into a conscious, shared observation. That single sentence doesn't fix anything by itself, but it's often the first moment either person has stepped outside the pattern long enough to see it, instead of just living inside it. There's a version of you underneath all of this that already suspected some of this before the study ever confirmed it. The version that's noticed, quietly, how quickly certain people feel familiar, how rarely that fast familiarity has actually correlated with the relationships that were good for you. That part of you isn't being paranoid or over-analytical. It's noticing a real pattern that a study of 6 million couples just gave you the language and the data to finally name. None of this requires you to audit every relationship you've ever had for hidden diagnostic overlap, or to treat every instant connection with suspicion going forward. What it asks is smaller and more usable than that. The next time something clicks unusually fast, let yourself notice the click without immediately trusting it as proof of anything. Recognition can be the beginning of something real. It can also just be your nervous system finding its own reflection and calling it destiny. You won't always know which one it is in the first week, but you can watch, over months, whether the relationship starts asking anything new of either of you, or whether it just keeps confirming what you already knew about yourself before you ever met. You are allowed to want to be understood, without that understanding becoming the whole foundation the relationship rests on. You are allowed to notice when a connection feels instant and ask honestly whether that speed is chemistry or recognition of an old familiar wound. And you are allowed to choose relationships and to do the work inside relationships that ask you to become someone steadier, instead of relationships that simply confirm, comfortably, that this is just who you've always been. Recognition feels like fate. It's usually just familiarity. Learn to tell the difference, and you'll start choosing very differently, not by rejecting anyone who feels like home, but by staying honest about what home actually meant before you decided to build a life inside of it. If this kind of clarity helps your nervous system settle, subscribe. PsychBond is a daily decoder for psychology, relationships, and avoidant and anxious attachment patterns, so you stop guessing. If this helped your body feel a little safer, liking this video helps it reach someone else who needs this clarity. Welcome to PsychBond. You're safe here.